I'm U.S. Chair of the History Department, and my job here is to welcome you and get out of the way so we're all going to introduce the speaker. But I have a little bit to share with you, so I will go ahead and welcome you, and then share with you something about my relationship to Ulysses S. Grant, which is to say that I have been living with the Grant problem since I was 6 years old. And that's one reason why I'm happy we have the speaker here tonight. When I was 6, I started my 7-year journey at Ulysses S. Grant Elementary School in Iowa. And one of the issues that occurred to me from the day I walked in the door was that there was no portrait of Ulysses S. Grant in Ulysses S. Grant Elementary School. There was a portrait of Washington. There was a portrait of Lincoln. There was also Lincoln School. There was also Whittier School. There was also Webster School, but never mind. And I, as a 6-year-old, wondered why there was not a portrait of Ulysses S. Grant in Ulysses S. Grant Elementary School. So I went home and I asked my mother, who was a very wise person, why is there no portrait of Ulysses S. Grant at Grant School? And she looked at me and she said, I don't know. And then she smiled. This little smile broke across her face, and she said, maybe it's the WCTU. And I didn't know what she was talking about, but my father was snickering. And I said, Mom, what is the WCTU? And she said, it's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I still didn't know what she was talking about. And I hope this can be explained later in this lecture. What the Women's Christian Temperance Union has to do with this Ulysses S. Grant problem that we have. But welcome to the Bottimore lecture, and I'll turn the floor over to Wade Rawls.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 20th annual Elizabeth Rolla Bottimore Lecture. These free lectures have been made possible by an endowment that was set up by the Rolla Bottimore Foundation in memory of Elizabeth Rolla Bottimore. You'll find a brief biography about her. She was a remarkable lady in your program. I wish I had known her because her contributions to our community continue to have an effect like they do tonight. On the back page of the program, you will find a full list of the Bottimore Lecture speakers and their topics. Over the years, which stretch decades now, the Bottimore Lectures have featured well-known Civil War historians and introduced to the museum and university audiences up-and-coming superstars in the profession, often speaking on their works in progress and offering new perspectives on the American Civil War. This year, it's my pleasure to introduce a scholar who is very well known in the historical profession and Civil War community, but I sense not as well known to Richmond audiences, though many of you might have had the opportunity to hear or see her at the last Sesquicentennial event at the conference in Charlottesville at the university. Joan Waugh is a professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she has taught since 1992, and from which she received her PhD, and where she has received this prestigious Distinguished Teaching Award. You have in your program a brief biography of Joan Waugh, including the highlights of her publications and her scholarly activities and teaching awards. In addition to what we have extracted for the program, Joan's official resume includes this note, and I quote, her dedication to teaching reaches far beyond the campus classroom, and she has participated in local, statewide, and national teaching workshops for elementary, middle school, and high school teachers. She led groups of Southern California teachers on Civil War battlefields and developed and led a summer travel study program for UCLA students to go on a 2-week field trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, Antietam, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. End of quote. By the way, notice that in California they need to indicate that Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania and that the Richmond that they're talking about is the one here in Virginia. It is those summer battlefield trips that first introduced Joan to our staff. We were honored when she chose to bring her students to tour the museum and White House of the Confederacy. You have to be impressed with the dedication of a Californian who brings a group of students to the Mid-Atlantic during what always seems to be the most humid week of the summer. In 2010, Joan's book, U.S. Grant, American Hero, American Myth, won the Museum of the Confederacy's Jefferson Davis Award as the outstanding narrative work on the origins, life, and legacies of the Confederacy and the American Civil War, published in the previous year. The book was also a Washington Post critic's favorite book, and a choice outstanding academic title, and received the William Henry Seward Award for excellence in Civil War biography from the Civil War Forum of New York. Think of that. She got an award named after Jefferson Davis and William Henry Seward. That's not bad, but you know they were actually friends in the U.S. Senate before the war. Joan subsequently served the museum as a judge for its Jefferson Davis Award after she had won it, and we are extremely grateful for that. Just as Joan is no stranger to the museum, so too is the subject of her talk tonight. I'm sure that many of you were in the audience for our 2013 Person of the Year Symposium in the Library of Virginia when Joe Gladhart made the case for U.S. Grant as the person who most influenced events in 1863. And some of you were among the plurality of attendees whom Joe persuaded to vote for Grant. And at the end of the day, it is significant that an audience right here in Richmond, and that is in Virginia, in 2013 agreed that U.S. Grant was the Person of the Year for 1863. I suspect that tonight's lecture will address that question, at least indirectly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce as the 20th Elizabeth Roller Bottimore Lecture, Professor Joan Waugh.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Wade, and I want to hasten to assure you that Californians are really not as ignorant as portrayed. They did know that Richmond is in Virginia, even though there is a Richmond, California. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to give the 20th Elizabeth Roller Bottimore Lecture, and I want to thank John Koski for inviting me and thank Wade Rawls for that nice introduction, and to be a part of an event for the almost new American Civil War Museum is a great pleasure. As you have already heard, I spent lots of time at the Museum of the Confederacy and am so pleased that it is a part of this new enterprise. Here's what I want to do tonight. I want to talk about U.S. Grant at the Civil War Sesquicentennial. Of course, it's already the post-Sesquicentennial now, but only by a little while, only by a few months. And really, we're going into the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction, which Grant had something to do with as well. But what I want to give you is an introduction to Grant, just to refresh your memory of him. And then I want to talk about General and President U.S. Grant in American historical memory. Look at Grant at the Sesquicentennial and why it's a time of revision, why these years from 2011 to 2015 sort of have culminated in a revision for Grant, and end with my own take on Grant and where Grant studies and Grant work is going, and that is looking at Grant as a soldier statesman. I realize that I may not convince all of you when I wrap up this paper in about 45 minutes, but I will try, and I am going to show a picture now of Grant in the Iowa primary school. They might have used this if they had any brains. But so this talk will be divided into 4 parts, and I want to begin. I always integrate PowerPoint visuals or some kind of visual into my talk, so I'll just show the slides. Sometimes I'll talk a little bit about them. Other times I think they speak for themselves. But let me reintroduce you to General U.S. Grant, who was commanding general of the Union Army and 18th President of the United States. He turned 193 years old this past April 27th, this last year of the Civil War sesquicentennial. Grant, like George Washington and Dwight D. Eisenhower, was both a professional warrior of a defining war and a twice elected president. I see those three as offering up some very interesting similarities. And like Washington and Eisenhower, he dominated his era, which in his case encompassed both the Civil War and its aftermath called Reconstruction, about 1862 to 1876. One reason mid-19th century Americans, not all of them of course, but many of them revered Grant was because of his humble background. They could relate to that. This is a medallion that was struck on his death, commemorating him and placing him with the heroes of the country, Washington, at least in the United States, Washington, Lincoln, and then Grant. But he seemed to prove to many people that, like Abraham Lincoln, an ordinary person born in humble, relatively humble circumstances could rise to extraordinary heights. And I've always thought that his biography is an inspiring story. It should inspire Americans today as well. Grant, if you don't know, was raised on the Ohio frontier. He was educated at West Point. He was a veteran of the Mexican War. He left the Army and became a hard-working farmer who outside of St. Louis on his father-in-law's land, who actually built his family a log cabin. Not that many people know about it. There are many presidents in the 19th century who claimed log cabin origins or residence, but few could prove it like he could. And he was working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois in 1861 when he answered President Lincoln's call for volunteers in that first spring of the American Civil War. Although fame and fortune had eluded this fairly modest man, he declared firmly and proudly for the Union. The 39-year-old Grant at the beginning of the Civil War did not dwell in obscurity for long, gaining fame in Mississippi and Tennessee with a string of victories that included battles with the names of Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. He did not rise to his position, of course, without some controversy. He suffered attacks on his character and his generalship. There's no doubt that he made mistakes, although he tended to absorb all setbacks and disappointments, displaying calmness and confidence throughout the war as throughout his life. He tended to accept the reality of any given situation and move on to the next challenge. Grant's rare winning record among Union generals secured him a champion in the White House, that would be President Lincoln, who promoted him to lieutenant general in March of 1864, giving Grant the strategic direction of the war and winning victories because he had responsibility for many Union armies in 1864, 1865, that guaranteed Lincoln re-election, and with that re-election, the end of the conflict. The Union's hero was praised for his generous terms of surrender that he offered to General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Together, the top general and the president who saw the war through and united their destinies were going to oversee what both knew would be a difficult post-war period. Now, there are some discussion recently about sort of a point that the war never ended, that Reconstruction was just a continuation of the war. But I can tell you that the people who lived back then knew that the war had ended, even though, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have a drink of water so early. I don't like to do that. It must be this rain. I mean, what is this wet stuff? We don't know about it anymore, and it's really affecting my voice. I want it to stop, and it will stop as soon as I go back to California. But I guess what I wanted to say is that these two men, Lincoln and Grant, united their destinies, and they knew that Reconstruction, the post-war period, the aftermath of war, was going to be incredibly difficult. A week after Appomattox, President Lincoln was assassinated. Shortly afterward, Grant became the first four-star general in American history, remaining as head of the Army until nominated for president by the Republican Party in 1868. Then Grant, aided by the newly enfranchised Southern blacks in states reconstructed by Congress, swept to victory with his famous campaign slogan, "Let us have peace." Once in office, the president, this is a picture of, you know what? I guess I wasn't showing you the right picture. The president, Grant, without his military accoutrement, proved to be a strong supporter of African American civil rights, as he was during the War of Emancipation and black soldiers. He proudly signed off on the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870, describing the law enabling black suffrage, quote, as a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. Yes, presidents even back then were capable of grand statements. After leaving the presidency, Grant made a triumphal tour of the world in 2 years, from 1877 to 1879, hailed by millions across Europe, India, China, and Japan as a military hero and the leader of a newly emerging world power. Rising in that way, he then retired to New York City, and he lost his entire savings in a financial scandal and was reduced to poverty. To earn money, Grant agreed to write about his wartime experiences for Century Magazine's spectacularly successful Battles and Leaders series. Grant's contribution to the Century magazine proved so popular that he decided to publish his military memoirs just as he was diagnosed with throat cancer. This is a picture of Grant at the place where he died in upstate New York, a resort called Mount Mcgregor. While dying of the cancer, Grant completed the writing of his autobiography, which brought renewed reverence from many citizens, and the 2-volume Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant, which you see here, sold 300,000 copies and became a perennial bestseller. Grant's volumes delivered a beautifully rendered narrative of the Civil War, written from the viewpoint of the man who, after Lincoln, was most closely identified with bringing about United States victory. Although imbued with the spirit of reconciliation between the sections, Grant's account made clear that it was the Northern cause. What is the Northern cause? Union and emancipation, that would forever remain and should forever remain the morally superior one. The Personal Memoirs is considered one of the great autobiographies of the English language and has earned status both as literature and as history. When Ulysses S. Grant died on July 23, 1885, he was the most famous of all Americans, both home and abroad. More than 1 million people watched his funeral procession in New York City on August 8, 1885. A decade later, the dedication of his massive tomb in Manhattan. How many of you have been to Grant's tomb? I'm surprised. That's a good number. Usually there's only one lonely person in my audiences. The dedication of his tomb on the 75th anniversary of his birth drew another 1 million plus. Grant's tomb, the largest in North America, remained New York City's most visited tourist attraction until 1929. Grant's beautiful memorial in Washington, D.C., which you see before you, it was dedicated on the 100th anniversary of his birth in 1922. At the foot of Capitol Hill, facing down the mall toward the Lincoln Memorial, the equestrian statue with flanking figures took 20 years to complete and is one of the largest such artwork in the world. How many of you watch House of Cards? Do you ever see the opening scenes? Grant's monument is prominently featured. Sometimes I just watch the opening scenes over and over again. The good news is that after falling into a scandalous state of disrepair, as far as I'm concerned, it is now being restored, and I can't wait to see the opening of it. As important as a legacy is to the making of modern America, as important and appreciated as his military career has always been, actually, and would continue to be in the minds of many, by the 1920s, a constant drumbeat of criticism had already diminished his reputation. Grant, the savior, had been supplanted the savior of his country, had been supplanted in many people's mind by Grant the butcher, Grant the drunk, and Grant the corrupt, incompetent president. Well, how did this happen? How was it so? For my answer to this, and I'm sure you realize I'm giving you my point of view from the perspective of a Grant scholar and someone who has read widely in the Civil War as well, is General and President Grant in American historical memory. Since the end of the Civil War, for one thing, ex-Confederates were busy writing books, newspaper articles, and giving speeches. Their version of history, as you well know, everyone in this audience, is known as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause is simply described, and it can be summed up as the war was not about slavery, but states' rights. Southern armies were never defeated, but overwhelmed by numbers. The Southern soldier was brave and true, echoing the perfection of its patron saint, Robert E. Lee. There's much truth in this myth, as there is truth in almost every historical myth and memory, but there is much that is not true as well. White Southerners, and I think this is understandable, thought of themselves as wronged people. They managed to transform their defeat into a proud and defiant sense of their regional specialness and unique identity. When I study the generation of Southerners after the Civil War, white Southerners, I see why for them the past was alive as the present. But I can't help but thinking that that old saying, forgetting the past condemns us to repeat it, remembering it too intensely also condemns people. It condemns them never to leave it. And that might be a problem in some cases. Respect the past, respect its integrity, know it, but let it go is sometimes what I feel like saying to the people of the past. To lost cause historians, whose influence, by the way, extended well beyond Southern boundaries, Grant was the enemy because he had defeated Robert E. Lee and the Confederate hopes for independence. If they could not defeat Grant on the battlefield, at least they could wear him down in print, and that is what they set out to do. They portrayed him as a man of limited intelligence and inferior military skills. This is one of my favorite quotes from Jubal Early, a Confederate lieutenant general and leading lost cause architect, I think many people have called him. And he summed up the attitude toward Grant perfectly. Quote, "Shall I compare Lee to a successful antagonist," he said sneeringly, "as well compare the great pyramid, which rears its majestic proportions in the valley of the Nile, to a pygmy perched on Mount Atlas." So there you go. Pro-Southern writers and speakers were influential in redirecting attention from Union victory to glorifying Confederate defeat. Some were journalists, others important military figures, and all repeatedly attacked Grant's military record battle by battle. Grant's generalship, they claim, was a fraud. His triumphs in the West were lucky, the result of happy fate or the incompetence of the Confederates. Although in reality, Grant's Western victories, including Vicksburg and Chattanooga, were very low in terms of casualties, it was Shiloh, the one exception, that was singled out as the harbinger of Grant's butchery. Further, the story goes, Grant only prevailed in the all-important Eastern theater because he possessed vast and unlimited resources. Grant's reputation has been tarnished ever since, as the arguments advanced by lost cause writers continue to influence to this day the ways in which he has been remembered by current historians and writers. One notable example in the 20th century is Winston Churchill, who wrote of Grant's quote unquote in his A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. When he wasn't running England, he was an historian writing many volumes. And he described Grant this way. He wrote of Grant's quote unquote unflinching butchery, arguing that, quote, more is expected of the high command than determination in thrusting men to their doom, and concluding that Grant's generalship, when compared to the incomparable Lee, whom Churchill worshipped, this is what Churchill concluded, Grant's generalship, quote, must be regarded as the negation of generalship. Churchill was neither the first nor the last historian to be perversely unaware that Lee lost proportionately more men than Grant in the Overland Campaign of 1864, which pitted the top generals against each other and clearly was the most important campaign of the Eastern Theater, bringing the war to an end. Personally, I think that if you want to call these two generals both names, both of them perhaps deserve the word butcher. I thought Churchill's line was very interesting. More is expected of the high command than determination in thrusting men to their doom. But I think that pretty well describes much or many of the assaults during the Civil War. But I don't think either of them deserve that epithet. I want to remind you that historical memory is very important in the way for all of us in a variety of ways. We know that the Civil War and its emblems, the Confederate emblems, has recently become a matter of great controversy. It seems to me the Confederate flag, for example, has always been controversial for quite some time, and it promises to be. But it is not unusual for each generation to select the memories about important events that fit their narrative, that fit their story that they want to tell about the present, and they select it from the past. And I think it has happened throughout history, throughout the generations from the Civil War to this day, and is still happening today. In the 20th century, this is Grant and Lee, as they never were in life, paired together forever on this Library of Congress postcard. In the 20th century, as Churchill's comments underscore understanding or appreciation of the Grant's cause, of the Union cause, of the United States cause, seemed to steadily diminish against the mythic appeal of Southern nobility and romanticism. It seems that today we've forgotten why so many people sacrificed so much so that the United States could remain whole. And the warfare conducted by U.S. Grant, there you see in a famous painting, U.S. Grant and his generals painted at the end of the war. The warfare conducted by Grant, butchered, drunk, and above all lucky, is repellent because it has been declared modern. Much of Grant's military reputation boils down to the meaning imparted to his ability to command overwhelming numbers. In other words, the more the men, the less the soldiers. Some would say it's the easy way out. People often fail to see or understand that Grant's commanding a large army and directing several large armies might have also been a great test. Is it not something to direct a force of nearly 1 million men across the country? At least one famous World War II general agreed. In 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower remarked that, quote, Grant devised a strategy to end the war. He alone had the determination, foresight, and wisdom to do it. In his memoirs, Grant showed that most importantly, it mattered to him that future Americans might be confused or would forget about or downplay the hardships of the Union Army and the accomplishments of winning the war, thus preserving the Union and bringing freedom to all sections. And he was worried about that even as he wrote his memoirs. Well, General became president, and this is a picture, 1868 picture of campaign picture, Grant and Colfax. He became president, and I really think that historians of the Lost Cause and subsequent generations of historians have really judged Grant the general on his policy of Reconstruction. Now, he never wanted to be president. He hated everything about being a politician, the press frenzy, the speech-making, the glad handling, and the extreme hypocrisy involved in every level. He was pretty happy in his military position, and with 4 young children, he looked forward to a lifetime of service in the U.S. Army, in the peacetime Army. Why did he become president? President Andrew Johnson's disastrous attack on Reconstruction, in Grant's view, drew his opposition and brought about a unanimous verdict for him at the Republican Convention of 1868. Still, he explained to friends that he had been, quote, forced into accepting the nomination in spite of himself. And that is because he was afraid that the goals of the war, union and freedom, would be lost to what he called mere trading politicians. He was proud of the fact that he was an unprofessional politician, that he was not a practiced politician. I mean, I'm not claiming he's a Donald Trump by any means. And he didn't have the hair either. But he entered the White House without the kind of political experience that so many bring to it, and so many fail with that political experience. But what he did have was the warm support of the majority of United States citizens. I mean, I think the important thing to realize that most Republicans, maybe not the radical Republicans, but most Republicans wanted reconciliation. They wanted North and South to come together again. But because they won the war, they felt that they could dictate the terms. And they wanted a northern version of Reconstruction. White Southerners and Northern Democrats condemned Grant's attempt to ensure freedom's rewards for African Americans. And the earliest academic historians writing in the Progressive era, these are the first generation of trained professional university PhDs who were writing, carried on the Lost Cause influence. They excoriated Grant for being far too harsh on former Confederates, with very negative repercussions for sectional harmony. I can tell you one of the most famous and influential of these scholars is very well known to all graduate students, PhDs, and academic historians. I don't know how well known he is now, William Dunning of Columbia University. He portrayed Grant as a cold-blooded killer during the Civil War and a dictator during Reconstruction. In short, decades of historians, and for my sins, for doing research for my book, I read many textbooks, or through many textbooks, to see in the 1920s and 30s and 40s how they portrayed Grant. They used the alleged excesses of Reconstruction to explain the necessity of Jim Crow laws, to defend lynching by the KKK and other violent groups in the South, to defend Black disenfranchisement. The caricature of Grant in popular perception did not always come. This is a picture of his second inaugural, where he changed vice presidents, Henry Wilson. The perception of Grant that was negative did not always come from pro-Southern writers fleshing out the lost cause version of American history. This is a very famous cartoon showing Grant as an amazing athlete there, sort of juggling all the corrupt rings that popped up during his administration. But there were lots of Northern critics to him. He had half of the North hate him, the Democratic Party, for the most part during his administration. And Henry Adams, a descendant of two presidents, made Grant the symbol for post-war America with two famous quotes. They're both great. A great soldier might be a baby politician, and the progress of evolution, said Henry Adams, from President Washington to President Grant was alone evidence enough to upset Darwin. His comments, I can't tell you, are reprinted and republished endlessly, even today, and I'm telling you about them right now. And really, the interpretation that emerged emphasized only the scandalous parts of the Grant presidency, not the complexities of the man and his career. In our own time, the negative portrait of Reconstruction has been turned upside down. There's no doubt about that. The generation of historians, beginning with the one heavily influenced by the second civil rights revolution of the 1950s and 60s, rejected the racist version of that era, which is now largely presented with African Americans at the center. U.S. Grant's presidency, however, has not for the most part been revised upward. This is a depiction of illuminating Henry Adams' comment about a baby president, and that is really what you read a lot in the textbooks and the history books. Grant's low presidential rankings, political scientists and historians are often asked to rank the president. Usually Grant is on the lower end, not quite as the bottom feeder like James Buchanan is, but pretty low. And this is throughout the mid-20th century up until this time. They're complemented by popular assumptions of his drunkenness, even though scholars have diligently separated rumors from fact and defend Grant against those who they think unfairly denigrated his reputation. In fact, I can assure you, reams of research and writing has been done about every single documented rumor and assertion and charge of Grant's drinking, and most of them are utterly false. He had a binge or two during the war, but the evidence clearly shows that Grant rarely imbibed and never when it counted. Nothing I will say or write will change it, but I do think that we have to be mature and balanced in judging our historical figures, our powerful historical figures. I wonder if we could look at Winston Churchill and just say, well, he's just an out-of-control drunk. He was. The charges were against him as well. And I always ask students about this endless stereotype of Grant drinking being perpetuated through popular culture and in some history books as well. I ask them, well, do you think Abraham Lincoln would appoint a raging, out-of-control alcoholic to lead the United States Army? Now, don't say yes. Just bear with me on that. as I said, the stereotype is endlessly perpetuated in popular culture and has been. I could give you a whole list of television shows from the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, that somehow decide to have a Civil War episode, mostly comedy, and portray Grant as a drunk. One of the most recent is The Family Guy. And The Family Guy happens to be my younger son's favorite TV show. When we were watching it, I was watching it innocently, not really enjoying it that much, but just trying to understand the younger folks. And when I saw an episode that presented a bizarre reenactment of Appomattox, in which Grant, wielding a bottle of whiskey, it's true, he did drink whiskey, shouts insults at General Lee. After a struggle, Confederate victory is declared, at which point a member of the crowd stood up to defend the Northern general by saying, "That drunken idiot kicked your sorry asses." End of quote. That's not me talking, of course. I'm a history professor. The cover of a recent novel about Grant had his likeness plastered on a bottle of liquor, and as almost every Civil War speaker, professor, even someone who just has the slightest knowledge about the Civil War, a commonly asked questions from our audience: was Ulysses S. Grant a drunk? Movie makers in the 20th century and in the 21st century have largely ignored his story. He has not appeared in a substantial character in Hollywood films since Harry Morgan played him in the Western epic How the West Was Won. It's a great story. Well, maybe you wouldn't agree, but his friendship with Sherman was interesting and was worthy of, I think, a buddy movie. So, I mean, Hollywood distorts everything. Why couldn't they distort that? But if you saw Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, Grant did make an appearance, and he was evidently sober, but he only was on screen for 60 seconds. In a blink of the eye, they were back in the legislative halls. Now, is the sketch that I have provided of Grant's reputation, both in the history books and to some extent in popular culture, sustainable? I think I want to turn this historical memory a little bit and talk about the late 20th century and the early 21st century, when Grant's reputation has begun to change. And I will take this cartoon off and put in this picture of a John Rogers sculpture entitled The Council of War. It was extremely popular, made and marketed toward the end of the war, sold many figures like this, and it shows Grant in close contact with Edwin Stanton and Lincoln, and it kind of depicts the importance of Grant and the seriousness of his role during the war. The new work provides a balanced and convincing major reappraisal of both Grant's military career and his post-war years, and in large part, some of the new work that's been coming out that perhaps is largely unknown to the wide swath of audience who's interested in the national audience who's interested in the Civil War, but it's really exciting, has to do with the now 31 published volumes of the U.S. Grant Papers. It started during the Centennial. It's winding up now. It moved from Carbondale, from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale to, guess where? Does anyone know where the Grant Papers are now? They were moved after the death of the editor, Joan Waugh Simon, from Carbondale, Illinois to Starkville, Mississippi. Grant took Mississippi in 1863, and he's taking it now. It's at MSU. I did a week's worth of research in June there. The place is beautiful. It's a presidential library and archives. It's an amazing archive they have. And Mississippi State University, backed by Mississippi State, is building a huge new place for Grant's museum and the library that scholars can work for. It's very interesting. But anyway, for the first time, all this information was been made available to scholars that was up until before the centennial, 1961 to 65, was scattered all over the country. And scholars like myself have worked on this and have just been terrible. It's been a real treasure trove of information. I now want to turn to Grant at the end of the Sesquicentennial, or post-Sesquicentennial. It's a time of revision, and I want to look at Grant, the soldier statesman. My own research and publications on Grant and reading all the new exciting work that's coming out, I've put together what I think is a new way forward to a more complicated, rich, and rewarding depiction or portrait of this vital historical figure. And I think my number one rule, as I would advise scholars to do with Eisenhower, is stop separating the general from the president. See how they both work together. Too often, the careers of a military leader who has a political career is thought of separate and unequal, like a great general can be a baby politician. A better way of looking at Grant is not to slice neatly his military and political career, but to approach it as an integrated experience, to emphasize, to perceive, to analyze the continuities in his life as a general and as a president, a soldier statesman. A question for people who are interested pursuing the answer, sort of the puzzle of Grant, is how can we assess the overall development of Grant's judgment and powers of leadership under extreme pressure from 1861 to 1865 in terms of how he approached the political side of his career from 1865 to 1876. I think that the stereotypical image of Grant could be replaced by one in which he emerges as someone that we could call an essential president. I'm not saying the greatest president, of course, but I'm saying an essential president who should go down in history as one important champion of civil rights and the president who kept the Union together during Reconstruction. We assume that the Union would stay together, the United States would stay together after being victorious in 1865, but why should we assume that? I think it was contingent, I think it was a dangerous time, and I think that only Grant could occupy the position of presidency during this time and have it out and have the outcome. You may argue with me, and I don't care. I know Ed will. He's thinking of really hard questions to ask me. In the war, Ulysses S. Grant's conviction that the Union was going to be preserved is what guided and sustained his military policy. He developed a broad national perspective on the means as well as the end of the rebellion. As a general, he not only planned and executed military campaigns, but also presided over the occupation of Southern population and territory. He formulated and implemented policies and practices that not only predicted Reconstruction, but was Reconstruction wartime, where he had to figure out the many, many different policies coming out of Washington, D.C. that could change just like that. The experience prepared him for the office of the president. He consulted with the highest political officials of the United States over these issues on a constant basis and was acutely aware of the political nature of the war. So yes, he wasn't used to the Washingtonian, inside the beltway kind of politics, but you could not survive as a top general in either army without being sensitive to the political machinations of both your fellow officers as well as the politicians in your respective capitals. I'm not finished with Grant yet. I'm looking to write a book on looking at his 3 surrenders, Fort Donelson and Vicksburg and, of course, Appomattox, and looking at them from the viewpoint of the soldier statesman and what these processes, the surrender and the aftermath, can tell us about Reconstruction, how it would be. After Appomattox, USG, Grant, and here you see a very famous painting, The Peacemakers, by George Healy, which commemorated the March 1865 meeting at City Point, Virginia, on the River Queen. And here is, Sherman was a friend of the painter, George Healy, and he clearly made Sherman the center, not the president or Grant. And Sherman was telling them what to do, undoubtedly. But after Appomattox, Grant remained a powerful presence, officially serving as General-in-Chief, overseeing the military part of Reconstruction policy for President Andrew Johnson, and had an investment in helping to establish a permanent and solid peace between the North and the South. His political bent was further burnished with the events between 1865 and 1868, in which Grant dealt with the political process in order to save the Union that was won in the war from being lost in peace. At least that was his point of view. As commanding general of the Army, he directed military policy in the post-war South, making decisions and taking actions that brought him directly into an unfolding crisis with the Johnson administration. During those 3 years, both President Johnson and the Republicans curried favor with General Grant because of his immense popularity and his powerful status as the Union's hero. His political position was solidified by his appointment as the temporary Secretary of State in a battle between Andrew Johnson and the Republicans in 1867. He held it for 5 months. He was at the center of power in a very difficult time, something he was used to being. And he held, I think, holding the office of Secretary of War proved vitally important to his political maturation. Grant was demonstrating to the country his understanding that the issues of the Civil War would continue to impact the public policy of the country for years to come. What this time reveals about the changing view of historians is the powerful connection between Grant's experience in the Civil War and its aftermath, Reconstruction. And overall, there are some emerging themes in the literature. And so I want you to consider some of these themes in Grant history writing that is being done toward the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. Except for Lincoln and FDR, Grant shouldered more grave responsibilities than any other chief executive in our history, dealing with a massively complicated job of reconstructing the nation, which can be described as the necessary stage after the Civil War. Of course, there were huge problems that weren't resolved. We're still dealing with some of them. But more of the revisionists on Grant, building on the work of academic scholarship that reshaped our modern understanding of Reconstruction, recognized that Grant operated amid very intensely racist forces in both North and South, which really made it very impossible to institute the sweeping reforms to assist African Americans. And Northern white people, this is what people forget, it's not only ex-Confederates, as more and more of them regained their voting rights, the men. Northern white people considered the main goal of the war, saving the Union, more important than achieving equality for African Americans in the South or in the North. In fact, studying Grant's campaign against the Ku Klux Klan and other actions that he took, historians find more commitment to African Americans than his people in the North were willing to give. In short, Grant is emerging in the history books as a thoughtful, intelligent, engaged president, fully aware of the responsibilities, duties, and difficulties inherent in the role of chief executive. Throughout his presidency, Grant remained steadfast in his belief that the goals of the war should be preserved even as the nation withdrew its support. I mean, I've often thought if Grant had only served one term as president, perhaps the successes of his administration would be celebrated rather than scorned for his support of laws upholding civil rights, for his strong support in enabling the 15th Amendment, for his generous amnesty to Confederates in the Act of 1872, for presiding over just a surging, if unstable, economy, for his reform program for Native Americans, for his peaceful settlement of grievances with England culminating in the Treaty of Washington called the Alabama Claims. Missteps, of course. In fact, the second term in which in 1872 he was the first president to be reelected and serve out his full second term since Andrew Jackson. He received almost 56% of the popular vote and 4/5 of the electoral ballots. But then things started to go south. Imagine that, a second term going south. We just can't even think of that. No mistakes have ever been made before. But in any case, these things are all being taken into account. Grant's final task as president harked back to his first and perhaps most important achievement to ensure a stable transition, this time in the disputed election of 1876. I have a son who lives and has traveled widely in Eastern Europe, and he's living there now. He went on vacation in Greece this summer. He came to visit me last month, and he said, "Mom, you wouldn't believe all the Syrians that were on the road." I mean, the results of civil war in Bosnia, it's just, we cannot take the fact that the country stayed together for granted. We should think about that. And as far as Grant, I would say few, if any, professional politicians could have done better, and most, I would guess, would have done far worse. Like Lincoln, Grant's fight was over the future of the Union. Only this time the issues were not secession and slavery, but what kind of nation would emerge at the dawn of the 20th century. Currently, a virtual avalanche of books are in the works, including one by Ron Chernow that I'm very much looking forward to reading. And if any of you have had the pleasure of reading this year's Davis Award-winning book, Crucible of Command, The War They Fought, the Peace They Forged, about Lee, a joint biography of Lee and Grant by William Davis, I would urge you to pick it up. If revisionists prove as resolute as Grant, then and only then might there be a chance for Grant to resume his place among the more important figures, the most important figures in American history. If justice as well as scholarship is served, Grant's presidential reputation will be much higher. It's rising in the ranking. He may not make the greatest list, but again, he will be called the essential president. Grant's legacy to his own generation was deep and wide. By the time of his death on July 23, 1885 at Mount Mcgregor, Ulysses S. Grant was an icon in the historical memory of the war, shared by a generation of men and women. They believed that an appreciation of Grant could only come with the recognition that he was both the general that saved the Union and the president that made sure it stayed together. My book makes that argument and makes the argument that for them, U.S. Grant was already both an American hero and an American myth. Thank you.